Hi, everybody. How are you doing? It is Kevin, Pastor Kevin here. I'm joining another conversation for our Disruptive Times. If you are joining us for the first time, we've been doing a couple of these conversations just because we're sheltering in place and trying to find some sanity in it all. And these conversations are meant to help us get grounded, hopefully inspire us and encourage us, all of that stuff. And today we have with me Siddhi Sundar. Hi, Siddhi. Oh, my goodness. It's so good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. And for those of you maybe who are logged on, and there we go. I got to take that down. For those of you who are logged on, and as usual, I've got a set of prepared questions that I want to ask Siddhi. And then towards the end of our conversation, you are welcome to ask some questions and participate in the conversation that we have here. So first of all, Siddhi, who are you? Tell us a little bit of background. I want to know. How did you find Spark? How long have you been a part of our community? Let's start there, and then I'm going to ask you a little bit about the vocation for why we're talking about storytelling today.
Absolutely, Kevin. So I found Spark about a little over a year ago, and that feels crazy because this community has felt like family in such a short period of time. And I discovered Spark through Pastor Omer. Working together, I had been reading for a really long time and seeking for a very long time. I didn't grow up in the Christian faith. I kind of stumbled upon it in a lot of spiritual exploration and seeking. And my husband and I were really looking for a community that was okay wrestling and asking those big questions where we felt like we could have that openness and transparency in the community where it was okay to ask hard questions, and it was okay for folks to not always agree. And I think this environment, sort of within our first couple Sunday visits to Spark, really fulfilled that spark that we had within us. And so it's been history from there, and it's been amazing.
Well, you and Adil are a tremendous gift to us. So the feeling is very, very mutual, let me just say. And I'm so sorry, Siddhi, if you could back up just a hair because of the screen. I just want to make sure the framing looks good for everybody. Yeah, thanks so much. Go. Sorry about that. Tell us a little bit about your current vocation. You have a TEDx talk from Syracuse, I think, from way back in the day. Is that correct? And then tell us a little bit about how that came about and your vocation then and then leading up to now.
Totally. So I'll give you just a little bit of background about myself. I was the Asian American kid growing up in a very Asian American school district who was terrible at math and science. And the thing that I found a lot of my joy in, and the thing that I was actually good at was telling stories. So I used to really thrive in language arts classes, history classes. That's where I was like, oh my God, this is what makes me come alive. And so that journey sort of took me to film school at NYU, where I studied film and TV production. And as part of that process, I became particularly passionate about documentary filmmaking in how it interfaced with social justice issues that I cared about a lot. And so that kind of launched this multi-year phase of being a struggling documentary filmmaker, trying how to balance like having purpose, but also, like figuring out where that next paycheck would come from. And that sort of led to making a ton of both feature and short form documentary content for really socially and mission driven organizations like Johns Hopkins Medicine, Baltimore City, public schools, St. Jude's, childcare centers. And as part of that process, what my husband Adil and I realized is that the narratives that we find in nonprofit and social enterprise storytelling tend to really over-index on vulnerabilities and weaknesses and things that are lacking in people and communities. Right. And that something about that didn't sit right, because all of the experience that I were having were, of course, like circumstances place people in positions that are really difficult, but individuals are also so empowered and capable and filled with potential. And that was sort of the inspiration that led us to start a nonprofit in India and Baltimore several years ago that really focuses on how can we help at-risk youth sort of shift that narrative and go from really that narrative they're so used to, which is the world talking about weaknesses and vulnerabilities and things that are lacking, into how do I talk about my strengths to myself and the world? And that was sort of where the TED Talk originated. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah, and it was beautiful and brilliant and so inspiring. And you're touching on the exact reason why I'm super excited to talk to you today, which is the narrative element. And what was so poignant, touching, moving, amazing is that the narrative and the storytelling in your TED Talk, at least, was most critical in students who had the most difficult challenges. So this to me feels like just so relevant for what we're going through to today, and hopefully a help to the people that are watching. So do you mind sharing a little bit about what you're doing now and who you're working for and what you're supposed to be doing?
Yeah. So at some point as all of our journeys go in really weird directions, that love for storytelling manifested into a love for consumer research. And so I work at Netflix right now on the studio innovation team. And what we're trying to do is to try to understand globally, there's so many amazing stories that we need to tell around the world. But the way that we make movies is still very antiquated, right? The same processes we used hundreds of years ago are the same processes that we often use now. And so what are ways that we can really make movie making more seamless, more magical, more technologically powered, so that the people who are making that content can focus less on all the logistical stuff and focus more on really superpowering their work and putting their heart into what they do.
That's
and
amazing.
So it's kind of this weird thing that hasn't existed before, and so we're kind of just figuring it out day to day.
So you're going from this passion of storytelling, narrative, documentary, filmmaking to now influencing a major media company in how they tell stories all over the world. I mean, that sounds like an amazing vocational trajectory.
Tiny cog in the machine, but it still brings me joy. So
that's amazing.
I'm very grateful for that.
That's awesome. Okay, so let's get down to it. We're going to talk about storytelling and specifically what it is, how it affects our biology, what makes a good story, what makes a bad story, why is it so important, and how can the skill or the art, and maybe we can even discuss about that, the skill and the art of storytelling can help us during disrupted times, especially times like these. And maybe we can even talk about the bad stories that are being told and how to combat those as well. So Absolutely. We got a lot of ground to cover. So let's start at the very basic. And we already talked about this. We will let the conversation go wherever you feel so led. So there's no rules here. We're crafting. You get to write the next chapter of the conversation. So
look at that. So clever.
Kevin. I love it. Let's just start with the basics. What is storytelling and why is it important?
Yeah, so this is such a good, and it's a fundamentally human question, because for as long as human history has existed, Kevin, before we really even had written language, before people had verbal communication, our ancestors were still using narrative as their way of communicating to themselves and the world who they were and what they stood for, right? So if we trace back eons ago to when our ancestors were using very primitive forms of visual storytelling in cave paintings, before they had verbal speech, before they had written language, all the way back to before people even really knew how to communicate in the way that we do today, they were still using stories as a way of documenting that recorded memory, of communicating to the world who they were and what they stood for. And I just find that so incredible that storytelling was kind of an ingrained component of who people were before we even had a notion of what a story was. And so if you kind of look throughout the course of human history, storytelling, from those early cave paintings to some of the first written texts that we have, like the Epic of Gilgamesh and Homer, to the really advanced, fancy, Marvel storytelling that we have today, there have been a couple of core functions that humans have used storytelling for to fulfill in society. And I think one of those is identity building, right? Mm-hmm. Stories are really humanity's way of making sense of who we are and recording that as a record for generations to come. And, we see this in our biblical text as well, with the Exodus story and many other narratives. But I think identity building and forming is such a critical function of storytelling in the world.
Yeah.
We've also seen, kind of studying groups of hunter-gatherers around the world from way back when, that another early function of storytelling was to communicate social norms, right? To codify ethics, to think through, like, how do we communicate to our community and future generations what feels okay, what doesn't feel okay, and to kind of have that social order constructed in narrative and provide like really amazing role models for society to look after and think about as they progress with life. So it blows my mind every day that stories have existed in this compelling fashion since the beginning of time. It's so cool.
Yeah. You also mentioned in an email exchange that we had not only identity, but transportation, right? You get transported into a different world. And another aspect of that storytelling is that transportation allows you to even imagine a different kind of a future. So it's who you are, what are the norms of our society, but what could the world become? What kind of future could we create together too? Would you agree with that?
Totally. So going into that like identification, transportation piece, something that I find so cool and that I nerd out on is that in the past couple of decades, there has been a lot of research that shows that not only do historically for the functions that we spoke about is storytelling important, but biologically as human beings, we physiologically respond to stories in a neurochemical way. And that is so fascinating to me. So if you can think of that moment where you sat in a movie theater, right, and you felt the grief that character felt, or you listened to that song and you're just like, oh my God, I feel like crying, or you read your favorite book and you just viscerally in your heart feel all of the emotions that character is feeling. The science behind that is something called mirror neurons. And the idea is that when we hear a story, our brain starts to reflect the actions of the person who is telling that story. And you mentioned that identification piece, almost start to take on that persona, right? We start identifying with those characters and who they are and what they're feeling to such a visceral extent that it almost feels like we're going through it. And to me, I'm like, isn't it insane that something so empathic can be happening at such a
I love it.
biological level? It's so cool. And like you said, a part of that is imagining, as a result of us being able to identify with stories in that way, what does that mean for our future? What does that mean for our world? What does that mean for us? Which is so cool.
Yeah. Every time I watch a Pixar movie, I'm kind of like at the end, I'm like, I'm not crying, you're crying. No, I'm not, no, right? It's like, because you feel so much what the character is feeling. You wanted to share a little bit about the structure of stories, and like there's this pattern of stories that seem to continually emerge throughout all of human history. Share with us a little bit about that and why that's important to understand, and how we have found ourselves within that particular pattern, I suppose.
Absolutely. So there's this really famous story theorist. His name is Joseph Campbell, and he's such a cool guy. He basically spent his career studying over the course of human history all kinds of stories, right? So ancient mythology, poetry, political stories and political speeches, modern day movies. And what he found is something called the monomyth, which is this idea that across every great story is a common narrative pattern that enables that story to be really amazing and connect with people. And that resulted in something called the hero's journey. And there's some really cool, fun, nerdy Star Wars hero's journey diagrams online if you're into that kind of thing and want to Google it. But the idea is that all core stories that compel us as humans have these three structural components. The first is departure. So this revolves around a character or a person being in their ordinary world, and something fundamentally changes that forces them to leave that ordinary world. It could be a call to adventure, a calling to go and achieve something, a great quest. It could also be, if we think about today's world, a radical change to the circumstances that you're in, right? So a fundamental change to your environment.
So relevant. Yeah.
a really fundamental change to your environment. And so all great stories kind of start with that. Hey, I'm a normal person in a normal world, and something happens to me that forces me to kind of venture into the unknown. The second piece is this initiation phase where now that I'm in the unknown, like life happens, right? These tests, these trials, these tribulations, these temptations, and all of those things in terms of conquering the unknown lead me to what's called my innermost cave, which is the moment in which I really have to summon everything that I've learned to tackle that huge obstacle. And across storytelling, that manifests in really different ways. It could be an internal obstacle you're facing. It could be an external obstacle like Lord Voldemort that you're facing. And so it's sort of that journey of a human being evolving in their circumstances. And the last stage, which I actually find the coolest and the best and the most beautiful part of storytelling as a whole, is this thing that's called the return. And that is this ordinary human kind of was put in a scenario with extraordinary measures, and they went through all of these things, and they came back at the end with a sense of rebirth or renewal, resurrection, and they come and bring that back to humanity, right? They bring that treasure that they've taken with us to the rest of the world. And that's the piece of stories that really stick with us and that allow us to take it home and apply it to our own lives. So I find it so cool.
Oh, that's so brilliant. So brilliant. Okay.
All Joseph Campbell. It's so cool.
No, it's amazing because, I mean, even as you're talking, we can all think of, like, sorry, I have to go to Star Wars. I know some people are going to go to Star Trek, but, you know, Luke is a farm boy and he just wants to hang around. And then all of a sudden, a significant event happens. His aunt and uncle are murdered by the stormtroopers, you know, by the Empire. And now he wants to follow Obi-Wan Kenobi into becoming, a Jedi. And he wants to go learn the ways of the Force, right? And then, of course, he has to face the challenges of Darth Vader, and he has all this development, and he has a guide that's also part of, I think, Campbell's thing. Yoda's the guide and the helper along the way. But then there's this ultimate return to who he has to ultimately find himself to be. So I think it's just absolutely brilliant.
A fun fact there is that George Lucas actually based Star Wars off of much of Joseph Campbell's learnings about the story arc. And so pretty much all these modern day storytellers you can imagine have been inspired by that paradigm.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned something that I think is really critical for understanding why this pattern exists. And if I remember correctly, because I may not word it in the same way that you did, but ultimately the reason why this pattern seems to be shows up over and over and over and over again in something is because that is actually a reflection of who we are. It's a reflection of the human journey. So I guess sometimes when we think about these stories, whether they're Pixar stories or, Marvel stories or whatever, we think of some character out there. But really, what's so fascinating to me about all of this is it is actually a reflection of who we are as human beings. And either the necessity or the drive or the desire, like whatever you want to call it, within us to actually be that hero, to go through that story. Is that, am I understanding you?
You're totally right. You worded it perfectly. And I think that gets at like what makes a good story, right? And I think great stories are mirrors. Great stories are mirrors for who we are as people and the world around us, even when we don't initially realize it. So on the surface, Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Dune, all of like our favorite classics, take us to worlds that feel so different from our own. But in the process of doing that, it is able to bring out such a fundamental and universal message about what it means to be human, that it doesn't matter if we're on Tatooine or Hoth or Hogwarts or the Shire. Like, there's that core message that allows us to kind of make a commentary or a statement or a reflection on, here's who I am as a human being in the world I'm in, and to draw those connections, right? Which I find so cool and fascinating. And I was thinking about this as we were chatting about it earlier. One of the greatest stories that is a mirror for who we are as people is the biblical story in many ways, because when we think about time we're in right now, right, with COVID. And everyone is feeling anxious and uncertain. Many of us are at a very low point. The Bible, through all of its stories, even though it was written for a specific time in a specific context for a specific group of people, has so many stories of people at their ultimate low point, facing the greatest uncertainty,
Yes.
feeling super vulnerable, wrestling with faith in God and what am I supposed to be doing? And the mirror there that's really useful for me is like, God is okay with that. He accepts that. He allows us to wrestle with that. And so I think it's amazing that even a story that is written thousands of years ago can continue to be a mirror today that really transcends time and transcends space, and allows us to make those human connections even like in the world that we live in today.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
I love it. I absolutely love it. This question just came to mind while we were chatting.
Yeah.
I think I don't know how to evaluate this, but I think all of us, when we mention all of those stories, we're like, yeah, I love those stories. I love those stories, and this is my favorite movie, and this is my favorite book. But the leap of reflecting upon the stories that we love to how we are to let those stories shape and mold us feels to me like a leap that not all of us make intuitively or we make intentionally. And this is one of the reasons why I think having a conversation like this is so important is we need to be able to mine the goodness out of the stories that we love, not just love the stories. And I'm just kind of curious if you have any reflections on that. Am I off? Am I off in saying I think we love stories, but we don't? There's a whole other level that is needed, or another step that's needed for us to see ourselves in the story. Like we go to the movie theater, we watch the movie, we love it, and then we go home and we continue on with our day without stopping, reflecting on, wait a second, the reason why I love that is it's saying something about who I am. So I'm kind of curious, do you think I'm off on that need? And if I am or not, what would help us become more in tune with what's going on with who we are? Because this is setting us up for later in the conversation. What would help us become more in tune with what's going on with ourselves in watching and reading those stories?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think it manifests differently based off of the kind of story we're experiencing, right? So us going back and rewatching Star Wars again and again and again because we identify with Luke Skywalker and he makes us feel a particular way is a very subconscious thing where sometimes we don't even know that impact is happening. And then we go and we show our kids those same favorite movies, and then they go and show their kids those favorite movies. And so there's something about just the act of passively consuming a piece of content over time and generations that shows that it is doing something to us subconsciously as human beings, even if we don't have like the most intellectually stimulating conversation about, what Darth Vader stands for after binging the Star Wars trilogy.
Right.
I do think, though, that you have a great point, particularly in the world that we live in today and the kinds of stories that we see out in the media about the world around that critical piece of engagement. And I've experienced this sometimes myself, where there's so much fatigue sometimes in hearing stories that are very compelling. And the stories that are really compelling often trigger something emotional in us, right? That whole identification phase. And sometimes that can just be a lot when you've had a really long day, when you're inundated with that. And I think our instinctual response in those moments is, I've gotten the story, it's time to shut it off, move on to my next day. And I think you're right in that there are probably ways for us to figure out how can we convince ourselves that it's okay to sit in it for a little bit, right? Like that sorrow we're feeling, that grief we're feeling, the discomfort. Like even with all the coronavirus news, like I found myself getting so down reading and listening to so many of these stories, even though there's some brilliant stories about people doing amazing things. But I shut it off because I'm like, I don't want to feel it. And I think if we were more open first to just saying, I'm okay feeling it, and it's okay to be in that for a bit, that would probably just open up more of that willingness to feel vulnerable and experiences. And I think a second thing, which is becoming more of a trend in the world now, is using great stories as a as a way to organize groups of people to have dialogue, right?
Yeah.
I've seen churches that use like movies as ways to frame, like discussions with congregations, or you have more and more organizations now that are using documentaries and movies and novels as a way of community building. So I think maybe if we felt like we weren't alone in the process of turning that experience of the story into something impactful for ourselves, and we were doing it with a group of people, it could potentially make us feel less vulnerable and more bonded to others so that we're doing that together. I don't know if that made any sense.
It made perfect sense. One, your first point, fatigue. We do get I think storytelling is often an escape, and so we use it in that way. So I don't have to deal with what's going on in here. I let the character of the story do that. But if we can embrace it, it's okay that's how we grow, that's how we mature, that's how we deal with the chaos of life, is we also have to sit within that story in the departure, in the challenge, and all that stuff. And then the second thing that you said that I heard is the ability for the embracing of the story to rally me with a community of people towards a common goal and a common purpose. So that makes perfect sense to me. And religious institutions do that all the time. And times of crisis require it. Stories that help compel us together. This is so good, Siddhi. This is so good. I'm
having
loving
so
it.
much fun. The one other point I wanted to make related to this is, like, we've talked a lot about like Star Wars and the Lord of the Rings, and like Black Widow turns into an Avenger, redemption,
Right.
and it probably feels like, okay, well, where are those stories of renewal and rebirth in my day-to-day today, right?
Right.
Tackling a global pandemic at a scale that many of us have never experienced in our lifetimes, and the media makes it really hard to sort through all of it and find those great stories that do have that rebirth. But they're out there, Kevin. Like, I
Yes.
see stories in the middle of all of the statistics and horror and grief about that ordinary person sitting on their couch who had that call to something greater and started a sewing business for masks, or a program to help seniors, or found love or connection or rekindled things with their friends, and then came back to share that with the world. And even though those stories are maybe rarer to encounter than the stories of the global pandemic being a really difficult thing to encounter, they're there. And so it's almost about training our minds to say, those stories are there, and how can we infuse our lives with as many of those as we do with the reality of the situation.
Yeah, it is a discipline. It does require attentiveness and all that good stuff. Okay, this is so good, Siddhi. What makes... Let's shift into how all of this that we just discussed can actually help us during this time. There's people that are at home with their kids. There's people that are losing their jobs. There's people that are really struggling with isolation and mental health and depression and all sorts of stuff that's going on right now. And we're starting to see these glimmers that maybe things might lighten up, but there's no vaccine yet. So we're going to be in this for a while. Let's ask the question, what makes a good story versus a bad story? Because it feels to me like part of what contributes, it's not the only thing, but part of what contributes to the negativity that we're experiencing during this time is that we are either consuming bad stories or we're telling ourselves bad stories in this time. So help us understand, or what would be your reflections on what makes a good story versus a bad story, and then how can we focus on all this better?
Totally. So I think we spoke a lot about kind of the elements of what make a great story. I think the key takeaways there are that great stories are mirrors. They help us in some way reflect on who we are, the world around us, and there's a takeaway, right? And that takeaway is usually some sort of renewal or rebirth or change, or there's some redemption that comes out of telling that story. And you'll read stories like all the time where a character goes from being bad to being worse. And you're like, well, where's the rebirth or renewal there? It's still, I think, like a meaningful lesson to take away about human character and behavior. So I think being a mirror and helping us understand that there is rebirth and a possibility for something new in every single circumstance that we might encounter in life is an amazing, amazing employment of good storytelling. I think in terms of a bad story, I would almost reframe it, Kevin, as a unidimensional story. And this is
Oh,
something that
nice.
I'm so passionate about, because I think that what makes a bad story is a story that convinces itself and everybody else that it is the only story about that thing,
Oh,
right?
hold on. That's brilliant. That so I'm so sorry to interrupt you. That was just so
Totally.
good. That was just so good because I think we think of bad stories as having either a bad plot or a bad outcome, but
Yeah.
you're saying a bad, to put it in air quotes, is convincing yourself. I'm doing active listening because I want to get this in my
Totally.
head because it was so good. Convincing yourself and the audience that it is the absolute truth or the only story, the only outcome that there is. Did I?
You nailed it. Yeah,
Oh,
that's
Siddhi,
perfect.
that's so
And I
good.
think,
That's so good.
because if you look at, right, like I wish that there was a universe in which the media today, whether I went to Fox or I went to CNN, would tell me, here's one version of the story, and here's three or four other versions of the story. And I think this unidimensional storytelling is what contributes to a lot of our fatigue and anxiety
Mm,
when going to the media. It's this idea that anyone has that ownership or monopoly over what the truth is. And so if you think about storytelling, every story can be
this is
told
so
so
good.
differently by so many people, right? You can take that same exact story, and you can even think of it as a parent. I'm sure when, like, you and Danielle tell a story to Phoebe, there are differences in the way that you might tell that same exact story because you're two different people with two life contexts coming in and telling that story. And I think when we stifle that, or we expect one thing to be the absolute truth, that's when we get into trouble, because not only are we limiting ourselves to the universe of other possibilities that exist out there, we're also convincing ourselves of something that isn't the full picture. I don't know if you watched this TED talk. It was by Chimamanda Adichie, who
Yes.
is, amazing
Oh
writer,
yeah.
and it was called the Danger of a Single Story. And
Mm,
she sort of talks about this experience that she had growing up in Nigeria, um, reading a lot of literature because storytelling was her escape. And in all of the books she read, it was foreign characters doing foreign things, to the point where what she thought that she had to do to become a writer was just talk about British people eating biscuits. And she was like, because that's sort of like the unidimensional vision that she had. And she had to spend a lot of time unlearning that great stories come from multiple places and multiple sources, and that she herself could feel included as a part of that journey. And I think part of it, Kevin, is that as humans, we kind of fear contradiction, right?
yes.
Like we can't make sense of it in our head. And the thing that I was reflecting on here that just blows my mind is, if you go to the Bible, our biblical editors thousands of years ago actively made the choice
Yes.
to have contradicting passages and chapters and even phrases like right after each other that either are mismatched or completely contradict each other. And they didn't have an issue with it. They embraced it. They were okay with it. And so
Yes.
I'm like, oh my God, how progressive for that time, that there was this radical acceptance of the fact that it is okay to have multidimensional stories told by different people that mean different things, that don't always form that perfect puzzle piece in our heads. And if only our media writers today were a little closer to the way that our biblical editors used to think, I feel like we would have a more kind of equitable storytelling universe, if that makes any sense.
Honestly, this last 5, 7 minutes was just pure gold. This is worth the price of admission. I mean, like, I cannot tell you all the things that are going on in my brain right now about how beautiful absolutism, uni, oh shoot, what was the
Unidimensional.
unidimensional
Yeah.
story, the exclusion, the inability to manage or navigate contradiction, and it feels to me like, in especially, so I got to ground myself because that was just so brilliant. In times like this, in disrupted times, those are the bad stories that I hear. You either hear it's all poop, it's all really really
Yeah.
bad, and it's going so bad, and it's never going to, and this person's horrible, or yeah, it's, everybody overblowing it, and it's absolutely this, it's good, and everybody's making things up. It's like one of these polarizations, and
Totally.
I kept feeling that none of this is why I don't like watching the news sometimes, because like
Yeah.
those stories and those headlines create a unidimensional narrative, and that's just not the reality that we're living today.
No.
And so if we're in shelter in place and we're like, I don't know what to do with my kids and all that kind of stuff, we have the opportunity to tell a multi-dimensional story, right? And that's what can often give us a sense of solace, a sense of peace, a sense of hope, a sense of identity, a sense of empathy, a sense of transportation, right? All of those things that we just talked about at the very beginning, all the redemption is available to us when we start thinking about a multi-dimensional story. I think
it's two ways. I think it's two ways, right? Part of it is like what's out there, which tends to be very, everyone has their own unidimensional perspectives, but I think part of it is on us too, right? As people, I think that we all go to media and stories for different reasons, and sometimes it's to feel better. So we actively seek something that is going to fulfill that need. And I would challenge us to think about how can we all as individuals maybe think a little bit deeper about why we're seeking the stories that we are, and expand our own search in some ways where we're okay kind of sitting in that contradiction and reading that thing that maybe makes us a little bit uncomfortable and forces us to wrestle a little bit. Because I think when we can train ourselves to be okay seeking that multidimensionality, the stories are out there. We just have to kind of put the effort in, I think, to find it, which is really hard.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna. This is just off the top of my head. I want to try something. I want to see what you think about this. Shelter in place. My child's at home, not going to school, or very limited, whatever. One story I could tell myself.
Yes.
This is horrible. I'm not going to get any work done. I don't know what to do. I'm just scattered, and I'm never going to get this time back. I'm never going to be able to accomplish that thing I wanted to because I have to do a lot of babysitting. So that's one story I could be telling.
Right,
and
for sure.
And I think that, let me just caveat that by saying some of those things may actually be true,
Absolutely.
Right? But that's the story that I'm living by. The other story that I could tell is my child is in the most precious formative moments of their life. I have an opportunity to spend more time, build a bond, and we get to discover together who we are as a family, what my child likes and enjoys, and the possibilities are endless, and I will never get that time back. So I'm just making this up off the top of my head as a way of trying to take all of these lessons of storytelling and apply them to this current context. I want your commentary, your thoughts, your reflections on some of that.
That's amazing. This, like the thing that you just did, which is like flipping that narrative, right, is the thing that drives me so much and makes me so passionate that is possible. And both versions of what you said, Kevin, are true, right? In their own ways. Both of them are totally valid experiences. The experience of your child being at home and all the caregiving that you have to give and not being at school is an entirely valid experience, but so is the other one that you described, which is filled with hope and beauty and love and all of those things that make it precious. And I mean, I have a question for you. When you told those two stories, which one made you feel better?
Well, that's obviously a no-brainer, right? I mean, thinking about, and this has to go with some of it with my personality and my past and my history, the stories that I bring to the table. But I mean, thinking about how I'm never getting this time back ever, and investing that time into a relationship that I'm going to have for prayerfully the rest of my life, that just delights me to no end. And I'm also so grateful because I feel so fortunate. I'm speaking very personally now, obviously, but I feel so fortunate that I'm able to see the fruits of that investment virtually immediately. And, my daughter and I have a beautiful, I'm just so grateful for the relationship that we have. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And Kevin, kids like friends of ours who have kids and, seeing the way that they view the world, a lot of kids tend to lean towards that second narrative, right? Which is, how do I tell a story that is hopeful and filled with adventure? And they probably don't even realize what things like renewal and redemption are, but the stories that kids tell almost have that baked into it to the point where it's like, how do we as grown adults sort of retrain ourselves to have that sense of curiosity and wonder and bake it into the stories that we tell ourselves about the world we live in. It's amazing.
Oh man, this is so good. Okay. Two last questions, and then we do have a question that came in from
Perfect.
Patty. Help us maybe give some very, very practical tips to our viewers, to our congregation, to these people that we love and care for deeply, about what would you recommend to them regarding telling and communicating and living out redemptive stories during this particular time. That's question one. And then question two is, I want to hear your view of the Jesus story as applied to this time and season. So those two questions, and we'll get to the...
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. They're two awesome questions. I think with the first one, there's like three ways I see stories kind of playing a role in our congregation and community, right? The first is helping seek comfort. I think there's many avenues already built into Spark, like the amazing small groups that are happening every week, the gatherings on Zoom and YouTube Live, where people are listening to each other's stories. I remember a small group a couple weeks ago with the Phillips, where Sarah was sharing a story with the rest of us about her kind of physician friends on the East Coast and what they were going through, and everybody else was able to engage in that story. So these environments that invite us to share in the highs and lows, and also to seek comfort in the fact that other people are thinking about and going through very similar things that we are, and that we're really not alone, I think is hugely impactful. So finding those opportunities, those moments to connect and to share, right? I think that a lot of times we feel bad sharing even the negative things that are happening in our day-to-day, because we're like, man, we're just going to bombard a person with the same stuff that they're already dealing with. But I think we'd be really surprised that sharing and being honest and being raw and talking about the two stories that you just said right now, the really upsetting one and the one that was really positive, with other people, can help us feel so much better and can help them feel so much better. So I think we underestimate the fact that sharing our stories, regardless of how good or bad they feel to us, can be a source of solace for other people. So I think there's that. And then I also think that this is a really valuable time for us as a community and as people and as families to figure out what's kind of our identity building during this time. What's our story, right?
Yes.
What's the story that we want to tell down the road? Like, this is such a fascinating time in that it's so unprecedented. We hopefully will never have to face something like this again in our lifetimes. But from that comes a sense of, here's who I am as a person, here's who my family is, here's who this community is. And I think if we can find ways to document those stories and to tell them and to share them with the world, it can help contribute and infuse more of that positive, redemptive, rebirth and renewal type of stories that we've been talking so much about, right? Like putting them out there as a community, putting them out there as people, I think is such a valuable exercise. I'm not sure how we go about doing that, but I think even just talking to each other the way that we've been as a community has been so helpful.
Yeah, and I don't think a lot of us are cognizant all the time that we are intrinsically storytellers. And so
Absolutely.
we are writing whatever that story and narrative is for us and for the world. So maybe an elevated sense of consciousness about that will help us write the most redemptive rebirth story that we can write, and
Totally.
and allow that to influence our identity and the sense of who we are in this world and for others.
Absolutely. And then to your second question about the Jesus story, one of the things that drew me to the Jesus story in all of my spiritual exploration and seeking was that Jesus was a masterful storyteller, right? And as somebody who's passionate about stories, to see that the way that he decided to use stories as a vehicle for his ministry is incredible. And there's this really long quote that I wrote down as I was thinking through kind of the questions you gave me that I would love to share, if that's okay. So I'm going to look here for a second because I haven't memorized it. But this is from N.T. Wright, and he says, Jesus didn't tell parables to provide friendly illustrations of abstract theology. He told parables because what he was doing was so different, so explosive, that the only way that he could talk about it was to use stories. The parables aren't simply information about the kingdom, but are part of the means of bringing it to birth. They're not a second-order activity talking about what's happening one level removed. They're part of the primary activity itself. They don't just give people something to think about. They invite people into a new world that's being created and warn of the consequences if that invitation is refused. Jesus' telling of these stories is one of the key ways in which the kingdom breaks upon Israel, redefining itself as it does. They also function for the same reason, as explanation for what Jesus is doing. The parables aren't merely theme. They do not merely talk about the divine offer of mercy. They make both the offer and defend Jesus's right to make it. And I read that and I'm like, this is like,
come on,
right? Because stories in the Jesus story are not just stories. They're not just parables. They're these like explosive, change-making agents, right? This is the way that Jesus wanted to communicate with us.
Yes.
And when I think about the Jesus story, the thing that also is mind-blowing to me is the gospel writers chose to leave the parables as these open invitations to us, right? Like you don't see that line in Mark that says, and then Jesus went to the side and talked to his disciple, and this is what he really meant by the parable of the prodigal son, right? So there's still that open narrative and invitation for us today to keep engaging with all of those stories in the ways that they might apply to our lives today and to humanity today. And so when I think about it that way, I'm just like, it's still this living, breathing document where every single story still invites us to be a mirror. And that to me is just like, it just provides a lot of solace, right? I think it makes me happy.
Man.
And then talk about the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell, one of the examples he loved using was the Jesus story in terms of being the ultimate kind of fulfillment of that hero's journey. And you think about in this time, kind of the darkness and the despair, and then you think about the Jesus story culminating kind of in that ultimate victory, right, over everything Pastor Daniel said at the Easter service, the forces of the universe, the oppression that exists in our world. And you're like, oh my God, we're going to get through this together and we're going to be okay. And so it makes me uplifts me.
This is so good. I love it. Okay, I got to get to these questions before we run out of time here. Let's see. There's just wonderful comments by Regina. Of course, thank you, Regina. We always appreciate your comments. Okay, Patty asks, Siddhi, can you offer some tips on getting people to share their stories during this COVID crisis? Stories that are more than the experience of loss, but stories that show points of strength. So some tips on getting people to share their stories. Like how do you urge or coax or encourage people to share their stories?
It's really interesting. Like as a researcher by profession, whose job is to like talk to people and get them to share some of their deepest stories. One of the best ways to do it is for you as the person who is seeking that story to put yourself in a position of vulnerability as well. And I think when we're vulnerable and we share with other people who may not want to open up, things that are hard for us to share, whether it was that really bad day we had or just that thing we wish we didn't say to our kid or spouse. And when we are willing to be vulnerable and open up about those things, we really invite that vulnerability in others. And I think that that's probably the biggest piece of advice and key I have, which is let's put ourselves in positions where we feel okay, not always being our best and not always sharing like that Instagram version of the lives that we live. And I think in doing that, it encourages other people to feel like it's okay for me to share this. I'm not bringing the other person down. Mm-hmm. This is helpful.
Yeah. It's okay to go first. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay. Right. And then you get to lead. You get to write the preface in some ways of the story to let other people fill in the next couple chapters. Let's see. Christine says, love how you contrasted bad or unidimensional storytelling with the multidimensional nature of the way the biblical stories are told. Makes me appreciate the love of the biblical narrative. Regina says, wow, this has forever changed my view on parables. So good stuff.
Thank you, Christina and Regina.
Oh my goodness. Identity, transportation, empathy, departure, hero's journey, redemption and rebirth. I mean, I cannot think of principles or concepts or ideas or human urges and desires that are more powerful and important during times, especially during disrupted and challenging times such as this. So my hope and my encouragement is that those watching will feel encouraged and inspired that you actually do get to write a wonderful and beautiful story, even though things may feel like whatever they feel like in this time and in this moment. Siddhi, this is so good. Okay, do you have any last words? We need to wrap it up, but any last encouragements to the Spark community? Sum it all up.
My last words is to go to YouTube and watch, whenever you're feeling anything, sad, down, whatever during this time, the married life sequence from Up, which is one of my favorite movies from all time. And I don't know if all of you remember this sequence, but it's the story of the couple from when they first meet all the way to the end. And it's a story that is filled with happiness and sorrow and beautiful moments and success and disappointment, but in 5 minutes of no speaking and pretty much nothing but a beautiful animated sequence, Pixar manages to tell us what the power of a story is. And I just think that it sort of sums up everything we've been talking about. Pixar always sums up everything good in the universe. And so my final thing is I think that just summarizes it. And then the other thing is just, I think we are just part of a super special community here, right? I mean, this doesn't exist everywhere. And so those moments we're feeling the ways we are, let's tap into each other and sort of our collective spirit and build that identity together so that when we come out of this, it's like, here's what we each stood for, and then here's what that spark story is of COVID-19.
Yeah, so. I love it. Beautiful. Siddhi, you are a gift. You are such a gift to us. I'm so grateful for this conversation. Seriously, I like just that one whole thing on unidimensional storytelling is just like that has forever shifted my thinking and how that applies to so many areas. Your passion for storytelling, your engagement with the Jesus story through all of this. I mean, everything about this was just absolutely beautiful and wonderful. I can't thank you enough. And I think everybody online agrees with me. So I'm right.
I appreciate it. Thank you for this opportunity. This was like the highlight of quarantine so far. So
yeah. Well,
I got to nerd out on stories with you. So
that's the story I'm telling, and I'm sticking with it. Everybody who's watching, thank you so much for joining us. I don't know about you, but this was fantastic. I hope that you are able to share it with some of your friends and family who are still sheltering in place and maybe need a little bit of inspiration and encouragement. This Thursday, I'm speaking with Pastor Omer on technology and now that we're doing this online, what is technology doing to us? Is it good? Is it bad? What should we be thinking about? All that kind of stuff. So that's going to happen on Thursday. And all the previous conversations that we've had with Pastor Danielle and Dr. Dave Chen and Pastor Tom are now all also online at youtube.com/Spark.Church. I hope you guys can check it out. Siddhi, thank you. You're amazing.
Thank you.
Love
Kevin.
you. Miss you so much.
Miss you too.
Can't wait till we see you soon. Yep. Okay.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye.